I would call. Oh my, so we just started recording now. All right, so let me start again. We are with Dr. Chartier and we're discussing his book, Loving Creation, the Task of the Moral Life. And I was just suggesting that this chapter 5 that's before us today is in the middle of the book, 4 before it, 3 afterwards, but it's a different kind of approach. In the first 4 chapters, it seems to me we have something we might call Christian philosophical ethics. And then in the last 3, something we might call Christian theological ethics, because they deal with the 10 Commandments, I think the Sermon on the Mount, the virtues and the vices, and so forth. Just distinctively theological resources for the moral life. But in between here, we have a look at 2 case studies, which display how this way of looking at the moral life can work in 2 specific ways. Now, and Gary has chosen 2 very important, but also 2 very sensitive and controversial topics. One is the use of force, and the other is eros. I have one big fear, and that is that people may turn to this chapter 5 first, not read the first 4, and not read the last 3, and maybe not get the full benefit of the argument. In fact, I think you begin the chapter with a section on eros that says, you turned to this section of the book first, didn't you? No, I have to say, I didn't. I really feel proud of myself. I did not turn to the chapter on eros first. That may mean I'm really old, but I didn't turn there first. I turned to what struck me as interesting, the philosophical parts. So then, but I do think if someone turned to that section of that chapter without reference to the preceding chapters and without reference to the succeeding chapters, one might not get the full benefit of what you are saying. Therefore, my question is, why did you do it that way? Why did you put those 2 chapters in the middle rather than say at the very end, when it would be obvious to the reader that everything up till then would have contributed to those 2 chapters? But these are hinged chapters between the more philosophical and the more theological, as I would describe them.
Okay, so two observations. One, I think those chapters are located where they are because they lay the groundwork for the treatment of specific issues later. And so I think, for instance, it would be difficult to take up some later issues related to force in the book without having talked about that in a more general way in this chapter. Similarly, certainly the discussion of the 7th commandment, I think in the discussion of the Decalogue, relies on the groundwork laid here with the vis-a-vis the discussion of the erotic. So conceptually, I don't think I could have placed these at the end without creating further confusion of the kind that I think you rightly note it would be important to avoid, because I think then if they came later, then they wouldn't be there to provide the context that I think they're needed to provide with respect to some of the material that comes subsequently.
Well, I think that's helpful, particularly for me, because I need to be informed, as I have just been informed, that this chapter, I should say, these 2 discussions are more general introductions to things that will be taken up in greater specificity later. That's a very helpful thing for me. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I should have. There are various things that perhaps I should have said about them and did not later, but there definitely, I think, is some context provided in this chapter for some things that the book will address later. So I do feel like it's important to.
Okay, just to quickly bring people up to speed before we turn into the chapter, I've jotted down what I think were the highlights of the first 4 chapters, and let's see if I am anywhere near correctly. The book begins with describing love as appropriate regard for the one who is loved, and the one who is loved includes oneself. And so appropriate regard for the flourishing or the well-being or the goodness of the life of the person. So now, what is appropriate regard becomes an interesting question. Not long ago at church, some of us heard about a man who spent $9,000 to correct the cataracts of his dog's eyes. Now, some would say that was appropriate regard. It was treating a member of the family like one would treat any other member of the family. Others would say that was not appropriate regard because, after all, this is a dog and not a human being, and that much money spent on a dog is not what would be appropriate. But that's an issue. At least we know what we're discussing. At least we know what we're debating when we talk about appropriate regard. Then you go on to say this is not a divine command theory. It is not a natural law theory. It's not an intuition theory, a theory that says some things are self-evidently true. But then you talk about basic goods. And I think this is critical to your whole discussion. You say a flourishing life consists of things such as, this is not an exhaustive list, an illustrative list, avoidance of pain, aesthetic experience, friendship, harmony with reality in the widest sense, imaginative immersion, knowledge, play, practical wisdom, self-integration, sensory pleasure, and skilled performance. I think all of those are I shouldn't say self-evidently, those are all manifestly persuasive. What I think is unusual about this list of basic goods is that it includes sensory pleasure, and that becomes pertinent later on to the discussion. Then you talk about love having these specific features: recognition. To have regard for something, or I should put it the other way, to disregard something is not to unnotice it. It's to notice it, but then not take it importantly. So recognition of its importance, the golden rule, which we have read, the Pauline principle, which we have read, commitment, and efficiency. That one surprised me. Do you want to say anything about efficiency?
Yeah, I also want to say something about recognition first. Just for those who perhaps haven't been looking at the book, I'm especially interested when I talk about recognition in this, that to love is, as Dave has already noted, to attend to the well-being of the beloved. And so recognition means that one's action aims either directly or indirectly at one or more basic goods, so that it's recognizing the value of those basic goods, either directly or indirectly. So, I mean, you may go to work every day just expecting to earn a paycheck, not with any specific goal, but recognizing that, the paycheck one earns may enable one to participate in various basic goods. On the other hand, one may engage directly with a friend precisely out of immediate concern to participate in the good of friendship. But either way, one is concerned about that, about the relationship between one's action and one or more basic goods, I think. About efficiency, I would just say, obviously, efficiency happens within the terms of our priorities and our commitments. That is, this isn't a kind of utilitarian understanding of efficiency in which we can do any sort of overall weighing of pluses and minuses, goods and bads, costs and benefits. But within the terms of those commitments, we can still ask whether we're proceeding wastefully or efficiently or not. And it's just important, I think, to make to be aware of that, and to make use of resources in light of the commitments and priorities with which we're actually operating, rather than ignoring those and being unnecessarily profligate.
Okay, unnecessarily profligate. That's a good line. how about saying a little bit more about what we mean when we talk about basic goods and how basic goods are related or not related to each other?
Yeah, so these various basic goods that we might talk about, life and knowledge and practical wisdom and self-integration and friendship and so forth. These are all matters, I take it, of developed potential. That is, of the developed, the expression of how we're put together, what we're capable of being and doing. And by saying that they're basic, what I mean is that no one of them is a kind of expression of any of the others, right? That when I think about, say, participating in the good of friendship, when I engage with a friend, when I get to know a friend better, when I support a friend, whatever might be involved there, that's something that's happening for the sake of the friend and the friendship. It's not something I'm undertaking on its own. At least we'd say for some other purpose. The friendship isn't really about getting knowledge or generating, sensory pleasure or anything like that. The friendship is valuable in its own terms. And the same is true if we think about seeking knowledge. Again, there may be kind of extrinsic benefits that seeking knowledge may yield, and sometimes we may pursue knowledge for instrumental reasons, but it's perfectly reasonable to pursue knowledge for its own sake. So that's what I mean by talking about these as basic goods, that no one of them is valuable just in virtue of any of the others or any set of the others.
I think that's important. I also think it's important to keep in mind that these basic goods are sort of enveloped in the whole notion of love as appropriate regard for the well-being of the other. Because if separated from that context, I think one or more of these basic goods could get in trouble if it were not sort of in that womb. And I think that that's something we need to keep turning back to. Since sensory pleasure is unusual in this list, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I think that ordinary people on a day-to-day basis do tend to regard sensory pleasure as a perfectly good reason for doing things. If somebody eats a piece of chocolate, somebody doesn't normally think that requires some special justification. Philosophers of a certain sort, though not philosophers of all sorts, have been hesitant sometimes to talk in these terms and to see sensory pleasure as among the things that might provide perfectly good, intelligible reasons for action. And I suppose one reason for this might be because of the worry that this might involve some sort of reductive hedonism in accordance with which all the things we do are really about sensory pleasure. But that's not at all the kind of move that I would want to make here. I don't think the person who eats a piece of chocolate for the sake of enjoying the piece of chocolate requires any special justification for doing so. But I also don't think that person's engagement with a friend requires or suggests or invites any kind of justification in terms of, quote, pleasure. It's not about some subjective psychological state that I'm trying to pursue. Rather, I engage with a friend for the sake of engaging with a friend. So I think this is a kind of, what I have to say here is a kind of moderate position. It takes seriously what I think most ordinary people who hadn't kind of puzzled over this philosophically might think, namely that there was something reasonable about enjoying sensory pleasure. On the other hand, we wouldn't at the same time, it wouldn't at the same time involve the kind of reduction of everything else to sensory pleasure that a sort of hedonism might involve. Instead, this is just one of many things that might take their place in a panoply of goals that somebody might pursue. Again, we're talking here about, as Dave notes, in a way, we're talking about loving, and so we're talking about loving in a way that's specified via recognition and the golden rule and the Pauline principle and commitment and efficiency, and all of these things figure in determining what would be a loving way to approach whether it's sensory pleasure or friendship or knowledge or anything else.
Thank you for that, and thank you for letting me pause before we get into chapter 5, because I think all of this is pertinent to understanding chapter 5 properly. This question just occurred to me as I was listening to you, and that is, some people say that pleasures ought to be assessed quantitatively, others that they should be assessed quantitatively and qualitatively, both. And we can think of important writers on both sides of that discussion. Does that distinction make any sense to you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm much more interested, I think, probably here in thinking qualitatively than quantitatively. I'm not really sure what it might mean to just as I don't think we can talk about putting goods of various kinds together quantitatively. I don't think it makes any sense to add up the amount of friendship and the amount of knowledge in the room and, think that we've engaged in some kind of meaningful computation. I mean, I think the same thing is generally true as regards, adding up the pleasure that you get from eating that piece of chocolate and the pleasure you get from, scratching your back. I mean, it's not clear to me that those are what it would really mean to say that those were quantitatively comparable in any way. And if they're not quantitatively comparable, I don't think they're quantitatively summable. I don't think that gets us very far.
Okay, that's fair enough. All right, now let's move into chapter 5, part A, a little more directly. And I'll just say that most of the discussions of this issue in Christian ethics have talked about the three options of pacifism, just war, and crusade, those three. And your discussion of it moves in a different direction. Can you help us understand why those three options aren't front and center in your discussion of this matter?
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think the approach here is more a just war approach than it is anything else, but it's probably idiosyncratic in more than one way. So first of all, again, I want to begin by I do begin by trying to frame this discussion with reference to love, and to bite the bullet there and to ask, under what circumstances is the use of force compatible with love? So that's one thing. I think that the difference, I would say, between what I'm doing and a conventional perhaps pacifist position is that I do think that there are contexts in which it is reasonable, in which it's compatible with love to use force. But I would also differ with a lot of just war thinking in really wanting to suggest robust systemic constraints on the use of force of a kind that I don't always see in the just war literature. So again, I'm not trying to rule out any and all uses of force, but I think we start out by asking, when is it reasonable for a particular person in a particular setting to go about using force? When is that consistent with love, as I've understood it here? But then I want to take a step back and ask the question, when might those making systemic decisions about how institutions behave, when might they become involved in the use of force? And I think that there ought to be real limits here, which mean that what I've offered is if you will, a muted just war theory, and one that's therefore very far from the crusade approach because of the limits that I think systemically might be appropriate.
Okay, then let's take those each one at a time. Under what circumstances would it be appropriate for a person who's acting in love, understood as appropriate regard for the well-being of the other, to take up force? Now, that's a very elastic term, isn't it? We can think of all different kinds of force. I remember once when I was much younger, one of my sons was playing with another son or two of other people before they were school age, and one of them bit my son. And quick as a flash, his mother bit him. Now, that was a kind of an unusual use of force, but I have a feeling that that young man never bit anyone after that, because she helped him understand how it feels to be bitten. So that's one kind of force, I suppose. But then we have these devastatingly destructive weapons of war on the other. So let's begin with the personal. Under what circumstances, as you articulated, is it appropriate for me to take up some use of force?
Yeah, so I want to emphasize that nothing I say on this topic I take to be particularly original or out of the ordinary within kind of broadly speaking the tradition of Christian ethics that I'm working in here, this tradition, which I sort of oddly perhaps straddle the ethics of love and natural law ethics. I don't think either of those would find this terribly odd, even though people in those discussions might sometimes disagree. So the key thing here, it seems to me, again, is to think about the issue of force in light of these various specifications of love that we've talked about. And so when you think about force here with an eye to, in particular, there are other things that might be involved, other things we might mean, but let's think especially about force as injuring or threatening to injure life and bodily well-being. And then it seems to me there are, it's the following, might be something like the way we would think about this in light of the various specifications of love that we've talked about. So the most important, it seems to me, is with respect to the Pauline principle, that we don't want to act in a way such that our purpose is to cause injury. That I think is inconsistent with the recognition of the genuine value of the various goods involved, and we can return to that if we want to. But I just think that's the basic principle, that we don't act for the purpose of causing injury. But sometimes I think when we discuss issues related to force, that is seen as really the decisive issue, and you'll see pundits and politicians emphasize happily that whenever some destructive act occurred, non-combatants weren't targeted. But targeting isn't really the only issue, because there's also the issue of side effects. And here I think the golden rule is primarily what's important. We want to ask about when it's fair to impose harm or risks of harm, even if we're not purposefully injuring. We still might recognize that injury will occur, and we want to ask whether, the simple way to think about it is, I suppose, is this an injury? Am I willing to accept a standard that would allow me to be injured, or that would allow a loved one to be injured under the relevant circumstances, even allowing that this wasn't intentional? And sometimes the answer will be yes, and sometimes no. Recognition, of course, is important here. The assumption is that I'm indeed seeking in one way or another to foster or protect or safeguard basic goods, most obviously the basic good of life and bodily well-being. I suppose it wouldn't necessarily have to be that, but again, the golden rule would come into play in limiting cases when that wouldn't, when that perhaps might not be the case. So the bottom line here then is that I think this approach, which is as old really as at least as Augustine, and certainly is very dated these days in Christian moral thought, but suggests that as a person, I act in a manner that's consistent with love when I use force, only if I don't seek to cause injury, only if I act in accordance with the golden rule, only if I, per recognition, am seeking some genuine good. Now, there may also be issues of efficiency. I may act wastefully in one way or another. I may cause unnecessary damage that way, and that would certainly matter. And of course, there may be specific commitments that might be relevant. So even if I don't in the book suggest that everyone ought to be a pacifist, there might be, say, for exemplary reasons, a commitment somebody might have made to being a pacifist in that case. And in that case, that person's commitment might also rule out the use of force. So that's the broad framework I'd want to suggest.
You've touched on, as you describe it, a long-standing distinction, which is also a very debated distinction. That is a distinction between an outcome that is foreseen and an outcome that is not only foreseen, but also intended. And there are any number, and this is also important in medical ethics.
Oh, yes.
As well as the ethics of war. But there are thoughtful people who believe that distinguishing between outcomes that are foreseen and outcomes that are foreseen and intended, that distinction is conceptually suspect and practically unhelpful. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I guess we'd have to get into the weeds on that. Of course, there are people who take that position. I don't think so. Whether or not it's unhelpful, I guess we'd have to talk more about. We can start out by saying, is it conceptually clear? I think I can make a pretty clear distinction between what my purpose is in acting and what it's not. And obviously, that's something that I may be the only person really able to distinguish, but it doesn't follow that I can't make that distinction, that I can't know, if I'm honest with myself, what I'm up to. In a particular case, obviously, I may be so caught up in the emotion of a moment that that may not be the case. And it's going to be important, obviously, for us to develop the kinds of habits that are needed so that we're prepared to approach situations in ways that don't involve us in choosing unreasonably. But I think purpose is an unavoidable component of choice. When I go about making a choice, when I decide what I'm going to do, I do it with particular goals, with particular ends in mind, and it seems to me that it would be odd to say that somehow I was unable to do that I was unable to tell whether or not what goals I had. Whether or not that's helpful, I think it strikes me as an odd question, because again, I think when we ask about what we're doing when we engage in moral judgment, my response is we're thinking about who we're becoming as persons in virtue of how we choose. And I think our choices are integral there. Our purposes are integral to what individuates or distinguishes our choices. So I'm happy to talk more about that. But I start out with the view that purposes are integral to choices. We can distinguish purposes, and therefore we can make assessments in light of the purposes that we've chosen.
I want to linger here because this is so important to your overall argument and so important to other areas of ethics, including bioethics. And what caught my attention is that you said that you yourself could know whether you were intending something or merely foreseeing it. So subjectively, you in your own mind would know. My question is there anywhere, and I've had to wrestle with this a little bit, is there any way someone outside of yourself could know what your thinking was? And I think there is. And I'll suggest two options, see what you think. One is if what one does is consistent with one's declared mental state. For instance, I remember a case where a doctor gave a patient a lot of pain relieving medicine, and the patient swiftly died. And there was a review of what had happened, and the young doctor said, well, I was just trying to relieve that patient's pain. And the more experienced doctor said, well, you gave that patient enough morphine to stop 6 galloping horses. Those were his exact words.
Wow.
And at that point, it was really hard for the young man to say, well, I was really trying to relieve pain and nothing more. So that I think one's actions ought to reflect one's declared hopes for accomplishment. That's one thing. The
Yes.
other thing, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just agreeing with you. I think that's very right. Now, I mean, I guess we can imagine a case in which, somebody has the relevant intention, but really has thought very sloppily about what might be involved in realizing that intention. And so that's a separate complex issue we'd have to talk about. But I think your test in general seems entirely right to me.
Okay, thank you. I have another one I'd like to suggest, and that is we might ask if this purpose could be fulfilled in a way that did not entail the negative side effects, would it be done that way in a more successful way? And I think here, surgeons know they're going to leave scars, but they try as hard as they can to leave the scar as small as possible. And they are working day and night to make them smaller and so forth. Radiation oncologists, the same, right? They know they're going to damage some healthy skin, but they work very hard to limit that, create big protein beam accelerators that cost millions of dollars to make that as pinpointed as possible. I think that their attempts to reduce the side effects, assiduous, vigorous, unending attempts to reduce the side effects suggest that there is in their minds a difference between an intended consequence and a foreseen one. Do you want to comment on that at all?
I think those again are great kind of behavioral indicators of what those people's intentions are. Absolutely. And I think the kind of counterfactual testing might or might not work in a particular case, but it at least points us to some degree in the right direction. And we can certainly see behavior which seems clearly inconsistent with the stated intention. And even we can asking about our own choices, if we're trying to tease apart our own, obviously sometimes complex motives, we can obviously ask whether similarly we've chosen in ways that really are consistent with what we take to be the purposes we've adopted. And we may realize there are some other things in play that we have to be aware of because of how we ourselves have behaved. So, because I certainly don't want what I've suggested, what I've said to be taken as suggesting that we're always transparent to ourselves either. I think that's of course complicated. So yeah, I think what you've said makes a lot of sense, Dave.
Now, I think the error can occur the other way too, and that is one might be fearful to use some implementation that's quite vigorous for fear that one is crossing the line here. And I've seen that happen too, where a patient wasn't given the pain relief the patient needed because the doctor was afraid that the doctor may be, in his own mind or her mind, actually trying to kill the patient. Now, according to the principle of double effect, there is nothing wrong. In fact, there's everything right about relieving a patient's pain if the amount that's required to do that, in fact, shortens that patient's life. Because, but sometimes I've seen doctors, I remember one case where a woman writhed in pain for 12 hours before she finally expired. And I talked to the chair of that department, and he promised me that that would never happen again. But the young doctor did not want to be accused of having killed her. And so she was left to suffer, I think, unnecessarily.
Yeah,
Do you want to
no,
comment on
that's
that
wrong.
at all?
No, I think there can be real worries there. And obviously some of those are worries about the actor's own moral integrity. Some of them, by contrast, are worries about how others will perceive the actor. And you know, there can be a culture that is unduly perhaps encouraging of risky choices, and there can be a culture that is unduly restrictive, that encourages just the kind of outcome that you've just described. So I think we ought to be avoiding both of those, absolutely. I think, you know, again, the fact that I don't intend an outcome isn't the only factor relevant to deciding whether to do something that brings that outcome about. But once I've recognized that that's not my goal, then certainly I think I can reasonably take into account the circumstances and the horrible situation you've just described with the woman who's in excruciating pain for an extended period. It seems to me those are circumstances that should make all of those involved in her care intent on doing what they can to you know, to relieve that, and certainly aware that, yeah, maybe in so doing her lifespan may be shortened. On the other hand, you know, they may be entirely consistent. Certainly it would be, I think, for me, it would be entirely consistent with the golden rule to say, you know, that's a risk perfectly worth taking, given how debilitating that pain clearly is for her, you know.
Okay, now maybe you would not want to get down to this level of concreteness and stay at a more general level and leave it to us to apply your more general considerations to specific cases. But I'll ask you about some cases, and if you want to comment on them, that would be great. But if you don't want to, that's fine. How would your understanding of loving forcefully help us to understand, or help us to relate properly, not understand, to relate properly to what's going on in Ukraine right now?
Well, so if we're to talk about, I mean, I feel like we'd have to get into the weeds about a whole range of specific issues there that I don't think, one, I should be pretending to have the expertise to comment on, and two, I'm not confident that I want us to kind of get distracted by that. Third, the issues there are often structural and institutional, and we haven't even touched on those yet with regard to what I've tried to say.
That's right. So let's go back to that issue.
Yeah.
We've been down the road of talking about what personal integrity requires here. Let's talk about the institutional issues now.
Yeah, so I mean, there are lots of things we might say, but suppose we start out with something like the approach that I've suggested to the use of force. Unavoidably, I think that's going to constrain very much the way we might think about force as individuals. And while there might be nuances and wrinkles and complications here, roughly speaking, I think we would say, you know, we're basically limited, I think, in these terms to using force defensively or to use a long, ugly, made-up word, vindicatorily, right? I mean, it might be that so in addition to defending oneself or someone else against an unjust attack, it might be appropriate to use force in the context of, say, obtaining compensation in the wake of something that's happened or something. But basically, we're talking about a real set of limits here: defense or vindication. So institutionally, there are bigger issues to think about, because we're not just thinking about what an individual does with regard to the use of force, but we're also thinking about the kind of ripple effects of large scale use of force. And that's something that I think we need to be especially concerned about, so that there are particular risks involved here, of a pretty diverse set of kinds. Right. So if we start out by saying institutionally, and this is a kind of standard just war constraint, that we'd like to talk about the use of force in war, we'd want to limit that to stopping the unjust use of force. That's certainly important, and that rules out, I think, for good reason, the kind of say preemptive or preventive use of force that is sometimes contemplated. And I don't think that's, I'm not trying to draw fine distinctions here between what happens when an attack is imminent and whether it's possible to kind of forestall that attack. But I'm talking about just getting involved in preventive or preemptive warfare. But that's not the only issue I think that we ought to be concerned about when we think about strategic concerns, because that defensive point really is just kind of the individual limit that I've already talked about writ large. So we need to be very concerned about the way in which political motivations can influence the public characterizations that states can offer for the use of force. We need to be aware that motives, that things can be cast often in very noble ways, but in fact, the noble language can result can in fact be an either intentional or unintentional cover, sometimes for mischief of various kinds. It's also worth emphasizing the degree to which military action, large-scale military action, can, perhaps unintendedly, make situations on the ground worse. I think an obvious example for us today here, is I think the way in which the Furies have been unleashed over the last decade and a half, on the ground in Iraq. And when institutions and infrastructures are unsettled or destroyed, as a result of military action, even if somebody's got very good motives, that can turn out to be, I think, something quite destructive. There are other kinds of issues that can be deleterious to the population of a country that is going to war. That can include the injustice of conscription. It can involve the other related kinds of things that might involve surveillance and the attempts to manipulate public opinion to generate additional support for a military effort. I think we also recognize that even if there are individual limits on individual forcible action in warfare that are officially acknowledged, once warfare begins, adhering to those limits can be very serious. And so, I mean, there are other things to say here. I try to spell these out in a little more detail in some other things that I've written. But I think there are, perhaps perhaps a dozen or more separate constraints, separate considerations rather, that give us real reason to doubt the advisability of of large scale violence of any sort, even if we think that there can be just uses of force. And I suggest as a result something like the merits of what Smedley Butler, the great twice Medal of Honor decorated U.S. Marine general, who spent an early part of his career kind of doing the bidding of, as he later said, of U.S. Businesses in Central America and so forth on behalf of the U.S. government, and became a real skeptic in later life about these matters. He wrote a little book called War is a Racket, which he talked about these things. And General Butler then went on to propose an amendment to the Constitution, arguing for a bright line rule limiting military action to the roughly just I think something like 750 miles outside the U.S. continental border. In any case, I think whether you want the exact details of Butler's rule, the important thing is to say, I think that given the real risks that large-scale violence poses, a bright line rule, one that it's easy to hold politicians to, seems to me, is the use of force ought to be, on the part of states, ought to be defensive, and ought to be limited. A state's use of force ought to be limited to the defense of its people and territory. That doesn't mean, as I note, that that's more of a limit than the limit I've already suggested in the individual use of force. And I don't, for instance, have any general argument to offer, let's say, against those Americans who went to Spain in the 1930s to fight against Franco and the fascists. It's not about venturing outside the terrain of one's immediate environment ever to help others, but it is to suggest that state violence, I think, is best corralled in a rigidly defensive way, because I think otherwise we run into all of these other risks that I've talked about. So there's a lot going on there, but that's just the 40,000 foot level.
Right, there is a lot going on here, and I'm going to try to bring it down maybe to 20,000 feet by asking if you find the distinction between a police action and a military action, that distinction which is made by many, do you find that a helpful one?
Well, no, I don't, because there might not be some distinction that somebody could make there, but because I think, again, large-scale violence is the relevant common factor, number one, and number two. So number one, I think large-scale violence is the common factor, and the concerns that I have are concerns about large-scale violence, whether or not you talk about that as military or police violence. It's the scale, I think, and its occurrence. Again, I think outside national borders. But the other thing is that we know in practical terms that the language of police action was precisely the language that got used often to draw Americans, for instance, into conflicts abroad that might well have been quite destructive and quite problematic. So I think the language of police action certainly is a sort of convenient cover, perhaps, for what seems to me just one variety of military action. So I stress again, bottom line here, I'm not in any way arguing for a kind of naive pacifism. I do, however, think that when states get involved in the large-scale use of violence, bad things happen very quickly, and a bright line constraint there is one way, at least, of reducing the likelihood of that kind of occurrence.
Okay, you just used two words that I'm going to echo back to you, because I think they what you say about these may help us understand your thinking. You talked about naive pacifism. What would you consider to be naive pacifism, and why do you reject it?
So I think a naive pacifism would be a pacifism which assumes that it is possible to stay safe and maintain security simply by appeals to goodwill. Okay, so I think there are other kinds of pacifism that are not naive and that I don't dismiss at all. There are kinds of pacifism which are rooted in the desire to exemplify a kind of Christ-like love that is best seen in refusing to offer violent response, and of course that that's a different matter and it is a more complicated matter. But I think I reject pacifism as a general kind of moral principle, as over against what might be right for some individual with a particular vocation or commitment. But I think as a general matter, because I think that it's not required by the conception of love that I've tried to articulate here. I think one can respond forcibly in a manner that is consistent with love. And I think for many people, if it is possible to respond forcibly in a manner that's consistent with love, it might turn out to be inconsistent with the golden rule, not thus to respond under some circumstances.
Okay. Is there something you want to say about the use of force, about loving forcefully, that I haven't given you a chance to say?
Oh, probably, but I'm sure as our conversation continues, things will come out. I think I've tried to talk about some fairly complex issues and probably in if anything, an overly brisk way. So I don't want to just keep rambling on. I'm sure there are others who want to get involved in the conversation.
I see Simona wants to get in, and let's have her first up the bat after the break. And I just, it seems to me that when we have, say, Miroslav Volf writing a book on exclusion and embrace, and he talks for the whole book about the importance of nonviolence and peacemaking and so forth. And then toward the very end of the book, he said, but I understand there are some cases in which we might have to use force to curtail the activities of a madman, and leaves it at that. It seems to me that that's not enough. I think that it's important to go beyond that and specify under what circumstances and in what ways that intervention should occur. So now one might argue, okay, they're just taking the argument as far as they need to go, but I think to argue for that long against the use of force and then in the end say, well, we might have to use it anyway without giving any other illumination to the issue is not helpful. Similarly with Chuck Scriven's book, it's an excellent book, and John Howard Yoder complained to me about it because he said that, well, Chuck in the end allows for using force to cut down a madman. And, and at that point, Yoder said, Chuck, threw in the towel. And yet, how could one say anything else?
So I think that's exactly right. What I suppose one might want is to ask about what I want to try to do here, and what I think it would be helpful for somebody to want to do in this kind of case, is to give us a principled basis for thinking about this. Because I mean, it seems to me that what Yoder's in part perhaps getting at about Chuck's book, The Transformation of Culture, is that it might end up feeling kind of ad hoc. And it's the ad hocery that might be a source of concern there.
I will hasten to add before we take the break that Chuck right now is writing things that will fill in
Excellent.
the argument so that it will not be ad hoc. But I agree with you. As it stands at that point in his book, it is quite ad hoc. And I think he's come to see the same thing. And he's actually spending a lot of time writing on that front right now. So that I'm looking forward to seeing what he comes up with there. All right, it's about 11:30, almost so, here in California. Let's take almost a 10-minute break, maybe 11's, and reconvene at 11:40 or
That sounds
so.
good. Yep.
And then we'll have people lined up to talk. Be sure to let Forrest know that you want to be. So far, I've seen Simona wanting to get on board. I think she was first. Then I saw Bob Ford, and there probably be others. Thank you, everybody. We will see you in 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to pause the.
Thank you very much for this presentation and for your book. There's always something interesting, but I'm a little bit worried about the way how you use the word force, because it seems that all these examples are pretty much about, about physical force. But there are other forms of force. There is a coercion, there is a psychological attempt to make somebody do something, right? When we talk about institutional use of force, then we can use laws and to incur an injustice on an individual or a group. So there are all kinds of other forms of force that we really should think about, because, for example, abuse is not just a physical abuse. It can be psychological abuse, gaslighting or other forms of psychological abuse. And I think it is really important to take these into consideration. And then I have a couple of questions. The first question is, how would you use this concept of love and force in issues of life and death, for example, abortion and death penalty? And then second question is how to view a conflict between my own interest and those of others when I'm using force in love.
So all sorts of things to say there, as always, and I'm sure that I won't say everything that's important. I think it is absolutely the case that there are all kinds of injuries that we can do to each other and indeed to ourselves that aren't physical. We can harm relationships, for instance, and I think that's something that absolutely matters. I think that, first of all, in broad terms, the general pattern of analysis about inadvertently knowingly but inadvertently causing injuries is going to be relevant in those cases as well. And so I certainly would want to suggest that the same kind of analysis should be employed. I do think, as regards what we do, especially institutionally, I guess I would say, I think not that there aren't many other kinds of injuries of which we should be cognizant, but that physical force is special, and I think we need to be especially concerned to limit it. And my own preference is to use the language of injury to capture what's going on both physically and otherwise, but to limit the use of force to the specifically physical, only because I think it's really important to limit the use of physical force as a response only to those cases where physical force has occurred. And I worry if we use the word force more broadly that we might be tempted then to start using physical force in response to other kinds of cases, not because those cases are okay, just because I think there are reasons to limit the use of physical force on our part. Let me just talk quickly about the examples you've noted about life and death outside the context of, say, of warfare. So my own view with respect to abortion, I think, is, this could just take us down a rabbit hole here, of course. My own view with respect to abortion, I think, is that at least in the early developmental stages, a conceptus or fetus isn't a developed person with moral standing. And so my own view therefore is that in those early stages, at least, that renders abortion perfectly permissible. Once there's some level of cognitive development that's happened on the part of fetus or conceptus, then my view would be you'd employ the same kind of general sort of defensive analysis here, that sometimes it might be necessary to perform an operation defensively that would have the inadvertent consequence of causing harm to a fetus. And that would be at least permissible in principle, in manner consistent with the Pauling principle and the Golden Rule, but that you'd have to just ask those questions about whether the Pauling principle and the Golden Rule were being adhered to in those cases. But those are in the later developmental stages.
So my question is it acceptable to use force to force women to carry a fetus they don't want? That's a use of force, institutional use of force.
Sure. I'm asking the question about the individual ethics involved of the deciding whether or not to have an abortion. It seems to me there would be no reason to interfere there at all in those early developmental stages. And we might think, look, it's going to be intrusive and inappropriate even in the third trimester, let's say, to get involved there. I'm interested in the ethical question. When does that become, when does the kind of analysis change? I think the analysis is such that there's no particular limit at those early developmental stages. And then at some point, there are going to be moral questions that arise. I think something like, we end up with, whether we should have ended up that way or not in the first place, but I think we end up with something like the Roe trimester framework for that purpose. I think that's probably the right way to think about it. I think that's consistent roughly with the approach I've taken. With regard to capital punishment, I just think I'm in principle opposed to capital punishment. I don't think because the justifications that are characteristically offered for it are either retributive or deterrent. I think the retributive imposition of harm of any kind is unjustified. We can come back and talk about that if we want to. And I think harming, we can welcome deterrent effects for doing something else, but deliberately harming in order to deter, I think is unjustifiable. So yeah, I would. The way I understand the approach that I've taken here, I think it would in principle rule out any kind of capital punishment.
The second question was about the conflict between my own interests and those of others when using force in love.
Yeah. So there, I think the issue is, for me, the way to approach that is by way of the Golden Rule, is to ask where there is a conflict, as for instance, I'm being attacked, or some third party is being attacked, and I want to use defensive force there. I am going to be unavoidably, if I use defensive force, causing an injury, let's say, then whether I do that or not in the given case is going to be a function of whether I'm willing to, whether I can accept a standard permitting that I would also accept if roles were reversed and I or a loved one was involved in one of the other roles in the situation. So I mean, I think the way the golden rule asks us certainly not, I think, to ignore our own interests or the interests of loved ones in cases like that, but it asks us to choose fairly.
All right, thank you. I want to go to Bob right now. Bob, he put some things into chat. Gary, did you get a chance to see is in the chat?
I saw a number of things that Bob put into
Okay. Why don't you, Bob, come out and raise the issues and dialogue with Gary?
Okay, briefly, this is around the whole arena of geopolitics, interstate uses of force, and the concept of deterrence, balance of power, and there's a whole arena of analysis and so on in politics, political science that looks at power relations between states. And so I was wondering, and of course, what makes that thing more complex is the changes in the technology of force, the capacity to project force around the globe and to not only affect your own country or your neighbor, but clear around the globe. So that kind of, to me, I was just wondering, how do your ideas fit into an arena where that kind of technology of force that is planetary level, how do you apply that?
Yeah, so I think this certainly relates to what I was trying to say perhaps too quickly at the end of my conversation with Dave in the first hour. I really think that we ought to be we ought to embrace a pretty robust kind of bright line rule on what states do. That bright line rule ought to have to do, it seems to me, with limiting states to defensive action. So I certainly don't think that it's that we ought to favor an order, a set of rules, a set of norms, however you will, that encourage the use of violence as a way of asserting influence globally. I think it is a standard, certainly not uniform, but it is certainly a widely shared view that the use of strategic weapons of mass destruction of various sorts is pretty clearly inconsistent with just war norms. And so you've raised that particularly. What you've talked about, yes, we could address separately from that. But I would just say in particular that weapons of mass destruction cannot, as far as I can see, be employed against populations, against non-combatant populations, in a way that is that's consistent with the Christian Church's traditional just war norms. And I think that that's a deliberate limit on engagement in certain kinds of geopolitical maneuvering. Again, I don't think that means one can't favor various kinds of defensive action, but I think it means that trying to assert power through the actual or threatened use of those kinds of technologies that I take it you have in mind seems to me to be very difficult to square with the just war limits that I've tried to affirm here, and which I think are, in many cases at least. And so here I just ignore the big question that I've raised about, a bright line limit on state action. I just think that the standard, even more permissive just war doctrine has very little room for the use of the kinds of technologies I take it you're thinking about.
I would agree with you that defensive idea. The only problem is that you have to look at particularly it seems to me what we're looking at in Europe today, and a lot of the rationale around Ukraine is that if you have someone on the other side that is not willing to stand by those bright line concepts of defense rather than threats, what do you do then? Do you encourage how one could encourage misuse of these technologies if you don't have a bright line and then stand up to it? And of course, there are thought leaders have said that the only way to make sure that a madman doesn't use those forces is to have it on your side and to have that balance of power, that deterrence that one can project. So it's a complex area of analysis for sure.
Yeah, and I think obviously that idea of balance of power, balance of forces is an idea with a very respectable pedigree in international relations theory. I would just say that what I understand the just war teaching of the church to involve is that there are there are some paths to good goals that one may not take. And even if a goal is clearly a desirable one, there are some, if it turns out that the only way of getting to that goal is by doing something that's in principle unreasonable, then that's a good goal, which is itself ruled out.
Okay, I agree with you on that. Just one other quick question, if you want to talk about it. You talked about police action versus military action. I grew up in Latin America, and I've worked in places like Haiti and Nicaragua and Costa Rica, Mexico, West Africa, where, quotes, police actions were used by bigger powers to constrain smaller powers, which had very, very serious effects that have lasted in many cases, like Haiti, for 100 years or so. So I would agree with you. I think I understood you saying that calling something a police action really is a euphemism for often a misuse of force. I don't know what you would say.
I absolutely agree, Bob.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I will now go to my friend Anastasia.
For a short question.
For a short question, yeah.
Welcome, Dr. Chartier, and we love your book and a lot of food for thought. You spoke, and I read it very carefully as well, about the large-scale wars, but also you spoke about stopping, even in individual cases, when we need to stop somebody from injuring us or our loved ones, and with this, without maiming or trying to kill the other person. And one of my questions are also, you did very successfully connected the three areas, the individual, with his participation in the polis and the church, and also individual reflection and moral life. What is our moral obligation when our state, well, secretly for the most part, did what they did, let's say, with the juntas in the 60s and the 70s in Greece, where they sent their own thugs, the CIA, to train Greeks in torture. They funded and put up those colonels, and caused the massacre of students, which was not a huge scale, but the Greek people suffered for 10 years before that. And then when Turkey, because Turkey and Greece, they were in NATO, when Turkey bombed the heck out of Cyprus that was innocent, our fleet, the American fleet, was right there, and they said, well, we cannot be involved in force because the two of them are fighting when they, America, instigated that. So what is our moral obligation? Yes, I understand with the Adventist Church, and I believe in pacifism, but pacifism is not, as you said very much in your book, is not to do nothing about it. Don't we have a responsibility to vote, to find out what happened with the Vietnam War? There were all kinds of wars before that in Cambodia and everywhere that no one needed. So what is our responsibility as loving a stranger, as Papa Nicolau said, and very well you also put, about finding out about those things, voting these people out, having a vote in the polis, but also in our church. It's one thing to have church and state. We have the nationalist, white supremacists that are very involved, and they do it all in the name of God. And then we have like Adventists and other churches that are totally out of it. So what is the balance, and what can we do about that on that ethic of love that God, Christ, has commanded us for the stranger? Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia, for thinking hard about issues that matter and for paying attention to what I've written and to what I've perhaps fumblingly said today. So I think the kind of mischief that you've described on the part of foreign powers in, let's say, in Greece, but also in Vietnam and in the rest of Southeast Asia and elsewhere. I think that becomes very clear as we read the relevant history. We see a lot of very, very doubtful behavior that certainly is well worth challenging. I mean, there's I think a question, a kind of empirical question that you've raised about, how it's possible to respond here. And the challenge there, I'm afraid, is that, you suggest that we vote people out, but I think what we notice is that these policies persist as, different people are voted in and out, because I think they're very much in the mindset often of the kind of permanent establishment in foreign policy in Washington and elsewhere, certainly in London and some other places. There's a certain kind of strategic set of strategic delusions, let's say, that I think are often embraced there. So are these things well worth opposing? Absolutely. Is there a way to persuade key decision makers to change their minds? Sometimes, though I worry often about their unresponsiveness to reason here. And I guess I would just finally say, I think you're absolutely right that while we don't want churches trying to dominate the political system, that certainly doesn't mean that churches can't make nonpartisan public statements about issues of real moral importance. And I think the sorts of things that you've noted are cases where I think you can certainly imagine that churches can say something without in any way being kind of inconsistent with a commitment to church-state separation. Now, I think the great Paul Ramsey, to whom I dedicated this book, among other people, was always very nervous about public statements by churches because he worried about the degree to which churches might kind of be inattentive to what was really going on in the weeds. And I'd certainly want to urge us, if we want to see public statements that might be influential, we're going to be most influential if we're most aware of the specifics and of the details, and if we don't, if we're careful about nuance, because otherwise I think it'll just be easy to dismiss us as kind of popping off, and that was the sort of thing Ramsey was worried about. But that doesn't mean that we can't find a way to talk about issues of real moral importance, and I don't see why we shouldn't.
Thank you very much. And the public opinion has a lot to do. The reason the second junta fell in Greece is because grandmothers, children, and everybody else, and the public opinion around the world changed. So at least we can influence that. I thank you very much, Dr. Chartier.
Thank you, Anastasia. I would now like to go to David. David Beglin.
Hi, Gary. Good to see you as always.
Pleasure to have you here. As I always say, I mean, David's one of the first people to provide me any real intellectual stimulation. So it's
well, I just have one question for you, and it piggybacks on some of the previous ones, I suppose. But in the context of just warfare, could you explain further how a state could act defensively, even forcefully against an enemy, without at the same time, without the express attempt or intent to do harm? How's that possible, really?
well, so here's the way I've understood the just war tradition to reason about this. That and roughly speaking, I think you might think about this counterfactually. So I can use force. Let's say you're trying to attack me, because fundamentally we think about this at the state level, but finally it comes down to what particular people do when they're pulling triggers and so forth. I think I can use force against you, trying to stop you from proceeding, without it being my goal that you be injured, much less that you die. And I can be aware that it's likely, but there's going to be a difference between the case in which, let's say, for instance, I am able to put you out of commission and then you get medical care, versus I put you out of commission and then I make sure to finish you off for the sake of finishing you off. In the case of a forcible conflict. So at least the way I take the Christian just war tradition to reason about this matter in this way is to say that when my goal is simply to stop you, and it doesn't include the purpose that you die or be injured, even though my act of stopping you, say by firing a bullet at you, might result in that, that's one thing. It's another thing when I'm instead deliberately trying to bring about injury or death to you.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That's clear. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to go to Peter now. Peter, you?
Thank you, Gary, for your presentation. I believe that your book about moral law is very appropriate for our society in which we are living today. A society which is a postmodern society, a very relativistic society. I have a few questions.
I'll make some notes, Peter. I may not address every single question if you have several, but please go ahead.
Well, I have 3 questions.
Okay.
First question: when you are talking about providing necessary goods, were you considering Maslow's scale? How he considered the necessary goods that we need for our life? Or is just talking in general about providing for somebody that you love the necessary goods? And the second question is, when you're talking about sensory pleasures, were you in agreement with Epicureans that believe that the main purpose in life is pleasure? And the third question is regarding the attitude toward war. As you know, the old Romans, they have a saying, si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, you have to be prepared for war. And you recall that during the Cold War, it was a movement for disarmament. And philosophers like Bernard Russell came up with the slogan, better red than dead. But in comparison with with him, we have also one of the fathers of the American Revolution, Henry James, that came up with another slogan, give me liberty or give me death. How do you see this problem of war, looking at these aspects? Being prepared for war and being well armed to discourage an enemy, attack you. Also a defeatist attitude of Bernard Russell, and also a different attitude toward somebody that wants to take away your liberty, and you are fighting for that, preferring rather death than liberty.
Okay, so lots of issues there. So let me start out. So I don't think the view that I've tried to articulate, we can have a historical discussion, I guess, about exactly what the Epicureans are up to, but I don't think nothing that I've said should be read as in any way arguing for the view that life is about centrally any sort of pleasure. So we can distinguish, I guess, between sensory pleasure on the one hand and kind of emotional satisfaction, which sometimes people will talk about as pleasure. You take pleasure in something. And in neither of those senses is the view I'm defending intended to focus on or to treat as central pleasure. So my view again is that there are many different ways that the life of a creature like any of us can go well. Different aspects of that life can go well, and I include here, without claiming that this is necessarily in any way exhaustive, though I hope it captures the broad range of possibilities. Life, knowledge, practical wisdom, self-integration, friendship, play, aesthetic experience, harmony with reality, sensory pleasure, imaginative immersion. These are all very different aspects of a life that's going well. And I don't think that any of these others somehow reduces to pleasure or should be understood as about pleasure. They're all independently valuable. And so by acknowledging, as I think sort of common sense tends to do, that say a simple sensory pleasure, take the obvious example, eating a piece of chocolate for its own sake, is something that's perfectly intelligible and reasonable. I don't mean to suggest that that's in any way somehow exhausting what I think a good human life looks like. I think flourishing lives are lives in which we pursue a variety of goods in accordance with what I think are these specifications of love that I've talked about. Okay, so that's I guess what I would want to say about your question regarding pleasure. With regard to war and preparation for war and so forth, partly, of course, these are empirical questions that I, as a philosopher and theologian, I don't have any particular expertise in answering. But it seems to me that as a general matter, again, I have indicated before, I'm not a pacifist. I'm inclined to think that the defensive use of force is under some circumstances appropriate. And again, I think this has been the majority Christian view over the centuries. And so I certainly don't think that an entirely passive activity, response to potential threats is appropriate. I also think at the same time that a commitment to being genuinely defensive rather than to doing things that might in one way or another provoke conflict or exacerbate or intensify conflict is also very important. And clearly a military buildup can play very much that role. So I think we want to be very, very careful about that. You know, I think we need to not be, again, naive about the idea that goodwill is going to erode all conflicts, though I think probably goodwill will do a better job than we sometimes give it credit for. But I also think at the same time that while avoiding that kind of naivete, we should also avoid the sort of bullheadedness that leads people to do things that intensify conflicts and make them more serious. I don't know how much more to say about goods. So the goods I have in mind, again, are just the various aspects of well-being or flourishing that I've noted here, and that I think are reasonable objects of choice for any reasonable person. So I never talked about necessary goods. I think what might make a good necessary really sort of depends on particular circumstances. Something is normally necessary in order to achieve this or that goal, I suppose. But I wasn't trying to say anything more than that. I'm just taking a kind of broadly Aristotelian or Thomist view here of diverse aspects of well-being.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I had Monty Butler up here for a while. Monty, you took your hand down. Did you want to put it back up? And
perhaps we've lost Monty.
yeah, it looks like it. Oh, there he is.
What my question was?
Yeah, what was your question?
Well, I think Gary referred to at one point about Gary, you said not inflicting pain in order to, you were talking about war, and I'm forgetting the exact phrasing, but you were talking about the inappropriateness of inflicting pain to teach a lesson, I think. Oh, no, it was criminal justice, deterrence, inflicting pain for deterrence.
Injury, yeah.
Injury for deterrence. And would you put that in the context of Dave's mother biting her son? Does that same concept relate there?
Well, in principle, it does, and I'm not, I'd have to think more about the example that Dave offered. I certainly think that, I think deliberately causing injury, I think is injury to some basic good or other, to some basic aspect of someone's well-being. I think purposefully doing that would be ruled out on the approach that I'm taking here. Whether and I think deliberately causing distress, deliberately causing pain, I think I'm inclined to say is ruled out there. I think that's going to be inconsistent with the Pauline principle as I understand it.
All right. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Now, did you have more on that, Monty?
No, I'll leave it at that. I think
Okay.
that that's a subtle or a soft example of corporal punishment. I think corporal punishment would go even further. But that one, there is a direct connection to trying to deter not just inflict pain, but to keep a child. The goal was to help a child understand what it feels like to be bitten.
Right.
Maybe the argument is the child knows what it feels like to be bitten. And maybe they need to be taught some other way rather than just inflicting that pain on them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really not a fan of corporal punishment of any sort. But
Okay. All right. Before I go to some, I would like to ask you a couple questions, Gary.
Okay.
I think you kind of cleared a little bit, but you used the word naive pacifism early on. I can't help but wonder if pacifism is just naive. In the human experience, since time immemorial, people have been, our cities have been fighting against one another. The Greek cities, the Sumerian cities, it just seems like that was part of life. Is it naive to think that we'll ever get completely peaceful?
Yeah. So when I say naive pacifism, as I say, I think naive pacifism is a kind of pacifism that assumes that goodwill is all that's needed to overcome conflict. And I don't think that's always the case, though, again, I think goodwill probably deserves more credit than it sometimes gets. I think that there's a more sophisticated and sometimes, we might say tragic pacifism of a sort that, we might associate with contemporary figures like Stanley Hauerwas, who I think would say, look, we're not claiming that we're achieving particular results this way. What we need to do is to be faithful to God as revealed in Christ. And that's what it means, on their view, to be faithful to God as revealed in Christ. And so my view, I think, is in general that can be a matter of, as it were, individual vocation, a matter of kind of what turns out to be your particular kind of way of exemplifying and symbolizing and expressing God's love in the world. But I don't think it can be a general moral requirement for the reasons that I've already suggested. So I don't accept that view, but I also don't kind of treat it. I don't think it's naive in the way that what I've talked about as naive pacifism is, because I think those people who think in the way that, say, Hauerwas does, have, they understand the point that you've made and are just prepared to say, we'll live with that. And so that might or might not be right, but I just don't think it's naive.
All right. And segue into Jesus, you've mentioned him a few times. The Bible's full of violence, especially the Old Testament. Then even Jesus himself, when you come to the book of Revelation, it just seems like it's naive just to think that we're always supposed to be standing for peace as Christians. I ask that rhetorically more than anything else.
Yeah, I don't, I think as I try to say in the a couple of chapters on in this book, I think there's something really important going on in terms of thinking about divine love that I don't want to. I'm trying to walk a very fine line, Forrest, right? Between, on the one hand, avoiding what I think is the naivete of pacifism of a certain kind, on the one hand, and on the other hand, not recognizing the, I think, authentic moral impetus that motivates the pacifist. And my view is that the commitment to reconciliation, the commitment to loving enemies, I think that matters, and I don't want to forget about it or paper it over because I recognize that it may sometimes be necessary. I believe that it may sometimes be necessary to use force. So I'm probably not going to make anybody very happy here, because I'm neither prepared to make a kind of vigorous, unqualified statement in support of pacifism, but nor am I prepared to affirm the use of force outside of very tight limits. So I'm just kind of in an uncomfortable position.
Well, I want to say thank you again for your work on this, and I know you're walking a tightrope without a safety net underneath. So anyway, David, I've got two hands up. They both had responses before. Do we want to take them, or do you want to just reserve them for the...
Yeah, let's take these up till 12:30, and then we better stop.
Okay, Simona, I'm going to come back to you.
Thank you. So I want to go in a different direction. in your response to me, you talked about harming relationships, and I'm talking now about individual. No, I'm talking not talking about the states. I'm not talking about wars. I'm talking about a relationship. You know, whether it's a romantic relationship, friendship, whatever. So it's a personal relationship, and you talked about, you know, harming relationships as one of the things that we should avoid. So what is in your mind, what would justify deliberately harming a relationship? And I'm asking this from a very specific point of view. I have a view that, I'm sorry if it's going to offend anybody, but I think men are exceptionally bad at relationships. They would rather talk about larger issues. They're uncomfortable about talking emotions, and they have problem with truth. So they often lie to themselves and they lie to others to protect whatever view they have. So what in your mind it means to love forcefully in a relationship? And in the same context, what is a justification to deliberately end or harm a relationship?
Well, so I don't think it's ever okay to deliberately, purposefully injure any basic aspect of well-being. That's the kind of fundamental point that I take from the Pauling principle. And so friendship is one aspect of well-being. I think deliberately injuring a relationship is an example then of something that's that I think wouldn't be appropriate. I think, on the other hand, it may be entirely appropriate for you to avoid certain kinds of interactions defensively, right? And it's the same kind of thing. You're not trying to injure that aspect of your well-being or somebody else's well-being, but obviously, you know, when the relationship is an opportunity under current circumstances for somebody to attack you in one way or another, whether physically or in some other way, then avoiding that kind of interaction has the sort of inadvertent effect of adversely affecting the relationship, but you're not trying to be harmful to the relationship, which is of course your relationship and the other person. So you're not trying to be harmful to yourself or the other person. You're trying to protect yourself from mistreatment. And it seems to me there, again, as with any other kind of defensive action, the point would be, number one, your purpose isn't to harm yourself, and number two, or harm the other, and then your action is consistent with the golden rule and with any other applicable moral constraint. So, I mean, I think, you know, of course, relationships can be malformed in ways that certainly can prompt us to defend ourselves from mistreatment in those relationships. But avoiding that mistreatment doesn't itself have to be an attack, purposeful kind of injury to the relationship. It can just be that that's an inadvertent, even if foreseen consequence. That's the way I would tend to think about it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And now for the pièce de résistance, we have Peter for the last question.
Very quickly, I wonder, Gary, when you are talking about naive pacifism, you are talking about a utopian, basically, pacifism, type of Thomas Morus in his Utopia, when he's arguing that if you are giving a neighbor that wants to attack you silver and gold, you will discourage him to attack you, because could be another way around. If you give him silver and gold that you have, that you will encourage him to attack you to get more.
Well, I think being aware of the actual real world likely consequences of a choice certainly seems very wise indeed, Peter. Yeah, in other words, when I think about a naive pacifism, I have in mind, I think, the sort of view which holds that gestures of goodwill are all that might be required to change an adversary into a friend. And I'm going to keep saying, I think we probably ought to give those sorts of gestures more credit than they sometimes do get. I'm not just I'm interested in dismissing them, but I also think that we should be aware that there's no guarantee that that's going to be the case, and that robust defensive action may be entirely apropos in some cases. So I think the naive view is one that assumes that the goodwill of an adversary is always so near the surface that simply putting one's own goodwill on display is all that's necessary to fix a conflict. And things are often, I think, more complicated than that.
Okay, thank you. David, to you.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Forrest, and thank you, Monty, and thanks to all of you for another stimulating conversation. I would like to just append a comment, and that is, I have sometimes expressed disappointment in the Adventist Peace Fellowship for having little to say. We are in a crisis like the one we are in with regard to Ukraine. But I've come to see that somewhat differently, in that I've come to think of groups like that as sort of like people who specialize in preventive medicine. And their job is to prevent us from getting into these terrible conflicts. And we don't expect them to have all that much to say once we're in. Preventive medicine doctors don't really have too much to say when somebody actually does get lung cancer. There we go to a surgeon. And I think maybe we should view the Adventist Peace Fellowship along those lines and not expect too much of them. Secondly, I do think the Adventist Peace Fellowship has reason to be concerned about the increasing comfort with the military that we see in North American Adventism.
Yes.
And I think that that's something we need to be worried about, and that we should listen carefully to the Adventist Peace Fellowship about that. Do you want to comment on either of those?
So I think what you've said dovetails, I think, nicely, Dave, with what I tried to say before about what we might call, allowing for the kind of qualifications that I make early on in this book about such language, a kind of vocational understanding of a focus on peace here. Not because I would expect everyone to take the same position, but because this group of committed people can, in taking this position, express something important about God's love in the world, and call attention to it in a way that is reflective of their distinctive circumstances and commitments. So I would be uncomfortable if they began to announce that everybody needed to agree with them or to take just the same role that they were taking. But the fact that they are taking that role seems to me to be important and expressive of something of real moral significance. And one of the things of real moral significance that I think they ought to be concerned about, and that they think they are concerned about, as you rightly note, is the degree to which war and military activities and so forth are treated with enthusiasm in too much of our culture.
Okay, thank you, Gary, once again for all that you are doing to bless all of us. And we look forward to continuing our discussion with you of this book, Loving Creation, the Task of the Moral Life. Here is the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.